Hi, this is John Harcher, and welcome to episode 43 of Keep On Grooving. Today we start our multi-part look at the band Traffic and how they crossed paths with Jimmy multiple times. They started out as four talented musicians putting together a new type of sound, mixing folk, pop, and jazz. They ended up changing lineups practically every time you looked. Okay, before we get on with the episode, a Keep On Grooving update. The documentary, Electric Lady Studio, a Jimi Hendrix vision, has been licensed to Sky Art Television, I believe it's in UK, with the intent to distribute it later this year. Why is this a big deal? Supposedly, John McDermott said the reason for the delay for the box set was because they were looking for a distributor for the documentary. A lot of us were like, why are you worried about that? But that's what their plan was. So we just had to wait for that to happen. Now it appears that has happened. So hopefully this means the clock is now ticking for the box set to be released sooner than later. I would guess possibly November, time for Christmas. It's possible it could be next March, but I'm going to go on the record right now and say somewhere between October, let's say mid-October to early December, the Electric Lady Studio box set will be released. One last thing before we start. Right as I was about to post this, we got the word that Dickey Betts had passed away. The funny thing is, Dickey and the Allman Brothers were right in the middle of my college expansion of my musical tastes. It's like it started with, like we talked about last year, it started with Clapton. And the funny thing is that Traffic was also involved. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I got into Emerson, Lake and Palmer a lot. Then it's 1987 turned into 1988. The first bands I kind of gravitated to expand my vistas were the Allman Brothers, based on Dwayne's involvement in Layla, and Chicago, the early stuff, the jazzy, experimental stuff before their pop evolution. As I've mentioned, I didn't get into Jimmy until like June. So when I started working at Pergament in April, I was really in an Allman Brothers mood, and that's what I helped get Darren into that. But yeah, I ended up seeing the Allmans probably between 8 or 10 times between 89 and 2000. Dickey was just a master of melody. That's why he was like the key guy for the instrumentals. His skills definitely did seem to take a dip right around the turn of the century there, which led to his removal from the band, which was unfortunate because it seemed later on he did kind of get his act together. It was sounding pretty good a couple of years ago. I was definitely glad he and Greg hashed it out before Greg left. So there's just not a lot of them left now. It's, as far as like the guitar gods, just off the top of my head, Eric, Pete, Keith, Jimmy, Page. We're losing them quite a lot these days, so just, like I said, enjoy them when you can. I know I did. I always enjoyed Dickey's playing, and, you know, of course, when I was a kid in the 70s, Ramblin' Man was on the radio all the time, so. And the funny thing was, all the times I saw the Allmans, I think I saw Ramblin' Man once, and it was only acoustic. I just found it amazing that, like, I remember the first time I saw the Allmans in 1989, that how much I liked an Allman Brothers show where Ramblin' Man was not played. So, rest in peace, Dickey. Episode 43, Cross-Album Traffic, Part 1 of however many we need. My first really solid memory of Traffic was at the October 1986 Journey concert at the Meadowlands. They used to give out these Playbill type magazines when he came in. This one had a music quiz in it. I remember one of the questions was, who was the subject of Elton John's Candle in the Wind? My buddy Ray goes, oh, Marilyn Monroe. Funny thing is, I don't think I'd ever heard of the song at that point. That would change a year later with the hit single with the orchestra from Australia. One of the other questions was, how many top 40 singles did Traffic have in the United States? The answer, 0. So why did I know the name anyway before that? The only thing I knew was Steve Winwood was in the band. 2 weeks later at the Rutgers Athletic Center, I saw Steve Winwood getting back onto the road with his Back in High Life album. And what does he do? Right, opens with 2 Traffic songs. Now, it took me a while to try to figure out exactly how to approach this. The most obvious thing would have just been to do a straight Winwood recap, and he'll of course be a major focus of these episodes since he's had the most impactful career. But focusing just on Steve doesn't quite capture the effect the 4 original members had on music over the years. You could argue Dave Mason had the most direct impact on Jimmy's legacy since he's on 2 of his most popular songs. But Chris Wood had a major contribution as well. So we'll do the lead up to the band and their first group of albums and stop somewhere right at the end of 1969 for this episode. And then pick up from 1970 next time. So first I'll start off with the guy who didn't end up making an appearance on a Hendrix record. Jim Capaldi was born in 1944 to an Italian immigrant family in Worcester, England. He played numerous instruments as a youngster, including piano and drums. In the early 60s, he formed a band named the Hellions, which crossed paths with a few other people involved in our story. He was the driving force behind the band, at first doing drums and vocals, then later moving to vocals full-time when they added another drummer. It was also in this band where he started writing his own material. The band went through various lineups over the next 2 years. They ended up doing a stint at the Star Club in Hamburg, which had more than its fair share of famous musicians come through its doors. Their time there helped them tighten up as a band, much as it did a few years earlier for a certain band from Liverpool. But for the Hellions, it didn't end up leading to a record contract, so the band decided to change their name to Deep Feeling. Soon after, they attracted the attention of Yardbirds manager Giorgio Gamelski, who was able to get them regular gigs in London. During one gig in September 1966, former Animals bassist Chas Chandler asked if a new American guitarist he brought over could sit in with them. They were reticent but gave him a shot. Immediately, the band saw the talent in the West Coast Seattle boy Jimi Hendrix. So Jim gave Jimmy his first break in London, yet down the line didn't end up appearing on any of the Experience albums. They still remained friends throughout Jimmy's time in the limelight. Now let's move on to another founding member of Traffic, but we'll be going back to the Hellions soon. Chris Wood was also born in 1944 and came from the Birmingham area. He was such an innate musical talent, he was able to self-teach himself to play both flute and saxophone. As a teenager, he played with a number of local musicians, including young drummer Carl Palmer and singer and keyboard player Christine Perfect, who we'd all know later on as Christine McVie, God rest her soul. Like a lot of British musicians of the era, he ended up studying art at school. He played in a local jazz group in the early 60s, but this wasn't how he'd make the main connection to his future career. His sister worked as a clothing designer for another band, the Spencer Davis Group. That band's time working with the Hellions in Germany also provided a springboard for what would happen in the future. More on that in a minute as we talk about the next member of the band to come. Dave Mason was a youngster compared to the other 2 being born in 1946 in the Worcester area. Being from there, he got to know Jim Capaldi and was the guitar player for the Hellions from the beginning and stayed with them for the better part of 2 years. But Dave was always sort of a wandering spirit, as we'll see over the years. Needing some extra money, he left the Hellions to play guitar with some local bands and work as a roadie for, guess who? The Spencer Davis Group. So recapping those 3, okay, let's get to the big guy, Steve Winwood. He was the real baby of the group, being born in 1948 in Birmingham. He was a musical savant from a very young age, playing piano by age 4 and also learning guitar and drums. He was also, not surprisingly, a choir boy with his uniquely perfect voice. Speaking of perfect, one of his friends at music school was Ms. Perfect herself, since, as we mentioned, Christine was from Birmingham. His talent was so obvious, his semi-professional musician father and older brother Muff, which is better, Muff or his real name Mervyn? They started playing clubs with Steve when he was 8 years old. They had to turn the piano so the audience couldn't see who was playing. They normally don't allow 8-year-olds in bars. In school, Steve gravitated towards the music many of his counterparts had, American rhythm and blues. He was so good he was able to back many of the musicians when they came over to the UK and play with local bands as their backup. He and Muff played together in the Muffy Wood Jazz Band when they were seen by Welsh guitarist Spencer Davis. He was so impressed, he recruited the duo to play in a group with him along with drummer Pete York. In 1964, they signed with Island Records, and soon after Steve's 16th birthday, they released their first single, a cover of John Lee Hooker's Dimples. Their first album, with a number of covers and a few originals, came out in mid-1965. Later that year, they released Keep On Running, a song written by reggae artist Jackie Edwards. Definitely Island founder Chris Blackwell's influence there, having started the label to promote reggae music and artists. The song was also notable since it, along with the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction, had an early use of the fuzz guitar effect. The song shot up the charts and hit number 1. In early 1966, their second album was released featuring Keep On Running and the band's cover of Ray Charles' Georgia on My Mind. That song sent shockwaves through the music industry. Eric Clapton was effusive in his praise. Word got around that there's this 16-year-old white kid who sings Georgia on My Mind just like Ray Charles. It was amazing. This helped lead to the creation of Powerhouse, a short-lived band with, pun intended, a powerhouse lineup of Clapton on guitar, Graham Bond and Manfred Mann's Jack Bruce on bass, and Steve and Pete York from Spencer Davis on keyboards and drums respectively. Interestingly, the drummer's chair was originally slated to be taken by Ginger Baker, but he was unavailable. What future repercussions that may have caused, the ultimate version of Cream and Blind Faith almost happened right then and there. The band recorded 3 songs for an Elektra record sampler, What's Shakin', with Steve singing all 3. Due to contractual issues, he was credited as Steve Anglo. Guess Pete didn't merit the same treatment. 2 of the songs became well known later as staples of Cream's live shows, Robert Johnson's Crossroads and Memphis Slim's Steppin' Out, which Eric would also do with John Mayall on the Blues Breakers / Beano album. The third was an old R&B song, I Want to Know. If you listen quickly, you might think it's a duet between Steve and Jack, but it's actually Steve's doing both parts. In 1966, the Spencer Davis Group had a second #1 hit with another Jackie Edwards composition, Somebody Help Me. With the band's success on the charts, Steve was able to finally buy his own Hammond B3 organ. The band released a third Edwards composition as a single, When I Come Home. Unfortunately, this didn't do well, relatively. It did reach number 12 on the charts, but after 2 #1s, this was deemed a disappointment. Think of Burning in the Midnight Lamp reaching number 18 after 3 top 10 hits by The Experience. Same type of thing. So the band was under a lot of pressure for a hit. That was pop music back then. #1 hit in March, under pressure for another hit by June. After trying to find another song, Blackwell essentially locked them in the studio, enlisted producer Jimmy Miller to get things in shape, and told them to come up with a hit song. Well, you know what sometimes happens under pressure. The band played around with a number of riffs, and Steve started shouting out words as placeholders until they could come up with real ones. One phrase ended up being, "Gimme some lovin'." From there, the song came together quickly, so fast the band had it locked down and went over to have breakfast at a local cafe where Blackwell found them. He was about to blow his stack when they went back to the studio and played him the song. Needless to say, he calmed down. The band felt they had another #1 single right there. Well, they were wrong about that, but not by much. The song hit number 2 in the UK, but did reach number 1 in Canada. But most surprisingly, it hit the top 10 in the United States, giving the band needed access to the world's biggest market. However, both Steve and his brother felt it was time to leave the band to explore new musical pursuits. As mentioned, Dave Mason was working with the Spencer Davis Group as a roadie. Around this time, he was also beginning to play around with learning an exotic new instrument, the zithar, which George Harrison had used on the Beatles' Norwegian Wood. Through their clothing designer, they knew about Chris Wood and his unique jazz-influenced flute and sax work. And through Mason and from their time together in Germany, they brought in Jim Capaldi. The four jammed at a club called the Elbow Room and soon gelled together. But the Spencer Davis Group needed one more release with Steve and Muff to satisfy their contracts and all. So going back to the same formula as Give Me Some Lovin' and basing it around Steve's Hammond B3, he and producer Jimmy Miller came up with I'm a Man for the band to record. And in a somewhat symbolic move to mark the transition to a new phase of his career, Steve brought in Jim, Dave, and Chris to play percussion on the track. I'm a Man proved to be another success, though only a top 10 hit in the UK rather than their previous higher charters. The song also hit the top 10 in the US. A couple years later, a cover of the song was a standout track for Chicago's debut album, Chicago Transit Authority. With that, the boys were now free to work on their band, which was dubbed Traffic. The idea was Capaldi's, who came up with it as they were crossing a street in Dorchester. Signing on to Island Records, where Muff was now an executive, Chris Blackwell rented them a cottage in Berkshire where they could come up with songs for an album. Though their roots were in folk, jazz, and R&B, their early output was pure Brit-pop psychedelia. Instruments such as the zithar and mellotron contributed mightily to their sound. Within a month of their creation, their first single was released, Paper Sun, written by Winwood and Capaldi and produced by Jimmy Miller. With the zithar and tabla at the opening, this was not your prim and proper English song. With that and the droning ending, it made its mark in rock music right off the bat. It hit the top 5 in both the UK and Canada, but as we said earlier, it didn't really make a mark in the US, chart-wise anyway. Their next song was already the first sign the band's existence would be tumultuous. Dave Mason came up with a song and presented it to the band. The other three weren't thrilled with it, but they did the song anyway. Hole in My Shoe had some similarities with Paper Sun with the zithar part and all, but otherwise was definitely a different animal. The ending of the chorus had them singing almost out of tune, and the middle was a spoken word section done by Blackwell's stepdaughter. Not exactly the ingredients for a hit single, but as I always say, hey, it was the 60s. The finished product didn't convince the other three to like it, but ironically, it turned out to be an even bigger hit, hitting number 2 in the UK, their highest charting single. The B-side, Smiling Phases, was more towards what they were looking to do. Makes sense considering it was written by Steve, Jim, and Chris. Jimmy Miller produced again and had help in the engineering booth from a name well known on this podcast, Eddie Kramer. In November, they released their debut album, Mr. Fantasy. From the writing credits, you could see a distinction. 6 of the album's 10 tracks were written by Winwood, Capaldi, and Wood, either solo or in some combination of 2 of 3. Mason had 3 tracks written solo, and only the final track, Giving to You, was written by all 4. The opener, Heaven is in Your Mind, is sung by Steve and Jim. It's a low-key number based around Steve's piano and Chris's sax, with a tasteful little guitar solo on the end. Sounds like Dave doing that. A goofy little tavern-type number, Berkshire Poppies, is up next, named for the landscape around the house they wrote the material in. They were joined on backing vocals by the Small Faces, Steve Marriott, Ronnie Lane, Ian McLaughlin, and Kenny Jones. Rod Stewart wouldn't be big for another 8 years. Did I just get a Ruddles transmission cutting through here? How'd that happen? Next up was Mason's first number, House for Everyone, and it continued in the Hole in My Shoe vein with odd instruments and sounds. It contains like this whiner making a sound like it's being played on a music box. And honestly, it would fit right in on either Sgt. Pepper's or Magical Mystery Tour. The next song was No Face, No Name, No Number, a quiet lyrical number with haunting vocals by Winwood and Mason's mellotron playing. The song was a favorite of Eric Clapton's and was part of his choices of Steve's material to play when they did their shows together in 2008 and 2009. The side ends with Dear Mr. Fantasy, the band's main contribution to the psychedelic era. This time, Steve plays the main guitar while Chris Wood does the organ part. It was sort of their answer to the era of the guitar god, Clapton, Hendrix, Beck, Townsend, and appropriately enough, it was covered a number of times by other great guitarists. Hendrix did one in February 1968 at Winterland with Buddy Miles on drums, an instrumental version along the lines of his later cover of Cream's Sunshine of Your Love. Speaking of Clapton, this was, of course, one of the songs he did with Steve at their aforementioned shows. It was the set closer for the encores. Mike Bloomfield and Al Cooper did a version on their 1969 live album. Their album partner, Stephen Stills, did a version in the 80s with Graham Nash that ended up on their 1991 CSN box set. And in the late 80s and early 90s, the Grateful Dead added it into their set, and it ended up on their 1990 live album Without a Net. It also ended up in the craziest place. There was this one movie with Billy D. Williams and Robert Carradine, and I think there were a couple of cops, and at one point they catch a guy, and Carradine drives the perp crazy. He's got him chained up, and he's on an acoustic guitar, and he's singing Dear Mr. Fantasy. It's a weird thing. I have to look up and see what that movie is. Side 2 kicks off with Dealer, a number written by Capaldi and sung by Jim and Steve. It's the most San Francisco hippie-ish sounding number on the album, though the lyrics certainly aren't about peace and love. Next up is Utterly Simple, another Mason number, this one containing the only sitar on the album. If you weren't listening closely, you might have thought it was Within Me Without You, Dave doing a very close George approximation here, both playing and singing. Colored Rain follows, written by the trio. If someone were to ask me what did Early Traffic sound like, I'd probably pick this tune, even over some of the other singles or Dear Mr. Fantasy. It's got the organ, the saxophone, Steve singing some semi-psychedelic lyrics, got an odd title. It hits all the marks. Next is another Mason number, Hope I Never Find Me There, a quick little ditty with phasing effects all over it. If anything says psychedelia, it's that phasing, flanging effect. The album ends with, as mentioned before, the only song on the album written by all four members, Giving to You. It's an instrumental, so no lyrics get in the way. It's a cool interplay between Dave's guitar, Steve's Hammond B3, and Chris's sax, with Jim holding down a jazzy backbeat. Definitely an eclectic album befitting the band's diverse tastes and influences. But they weren't done yet. Much like their counterparts Cream, they got involved with the zeitgeist of their times via a film soundtrack. In this case, they contributed 3 songs to the soundtrack for the British film Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. Interestingly enough, the other big contributor to the soundtrack was the current iteration of the Spencer Davis Group, who also appeared in the film. Much like the Savage Seven for Cream, the film didn't leave a lot of ripples here in the future. The only people we might know are Judy Geeson, who was in To Sir With Love with Sidney Poitier, and then Helm Elliott, best known to us as Dr. Marcus Brody in the Indiana Jones films. Traffic did the title track, which was released as a single. Another original called, get this, Am I What I Was or Am I What I Am? Sounds like a hippie version of Popeye. Then they also included an alternate take of Utterly Simple. But wait, there's still more. When the album was released in the US, you know what happened. Their label, United Artists, did what all the other labels did and redid the album. This time they also retitled it as Heaven Is In Your Mind, which had 12 tracks. Okay, that makes sense. They just added 2 songs. Oh no, it's not that simple. They actually dropped 2 songs and added 3 and a half. Let's go through this slowly. The album opens with Paper Sun, but it's only 3 minutes and 26 seconds instead of the 4 minutes and 12 seconds of the original single. Then comes Dealer and Colored Rain, which were on side 2 of the UK album. Then all 3 minutes of Hole in My Shoe were there, followed by No Face, No Name, and No Number, basically where it is on the original album. The side ends with the title track, Heaven Is In Your Mind. I get why they had Paper Sun as an opener, but why not do this second? Well, I guess the end of side 1 is okay. On to side 2, which begins with House for Everyone. Now, apart from Hole in My Shoe, this is Mason's only solo song on the album. It's utterly simple, and Hope I Never Find Me There were the 2 songs dropped. Then came Berkshire Poppies and Giving to You, but it depended on whether you got the mono or stereo, which Giving to You was on there. The mono version had the original B-side, The Paper Sun, which had Steve talking over the intro. The stereo version had the straight instrumental. Then came Smiley Faces and Dear Mr. Fantasy. The album ends with a minute-long snippet called We're a Fade, You Missed Us. In reality, it was just a missing 53 seconds from the end of Paper Sun that wasn't on side 1. And just to make things even more fun, the label included a little snippet of Here We Go Around the Mulberry Bush in between a lot of the songs. So this was a unique release in and of itself. When the second pressing came around, United Artists changed the name back to Mr. Fantasy, but left the cover the same with just the 3 band members. Yes, 3. By the time it came around to releasing the album in the US in early 1968, Mason had decided to leave the band. As we could see by the types of songs Steve, Jim, and Chris were writing compared to Dave's material, they were clearly going in different directions. So in January, they literally went in different directions. The 3 remaining members went on the road while Mason helped produce the debut album of the UK band Family. They came and went quickly, but one of the members ended up crossing paths with the band later, the bass player Rick Gresh. However, that wasn't the only side work Mason did at the time. In an odd bit of timing, right as Dave was going to leave the band, Traffic played the Christmas on Earth Continued show on December 17, 1967. They played in a show with Pink Floyd, in Syd Barrett's last appearance with the band, The Move, and, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. We've talked about their set during our annual holiday show. During the Experience's late December recording sessions at Olympic, Mason was a frequent guest. He helped contribute backing vocals and kazoo sounds to Crosstown Traffic during the sessions before Christmas. After the holiday on the 28th, he contributed to the 2 takes of a song called Little One. The first had Dave playing guitar, the second had him on slide. The first take was released on West Coast Seattle Boy and was used as the basis for the 1987 posthumous recording There Ain't Nothing Wrong With That, with Noel Redding on vocals. It's actually a really good song. They did a great job on it. After the holidays, Jimmy had just gotten hold of a demo by Bob Dylan of a song that was going to be on his upcoming album, John Wesley Harding. Being the huge Dylan fan he wanted to do his version. So he brought Noel, Mitch, Dave, and Brian Jones into the studio to do the recording. The first take had Dave on acoustic guitar and Brian on piano. The piano part didn't work, so Jones went over to percussion. Noel got annoyed and left, so they cut the song without him, and Dave later overdubbed the bass part. Later, Jimmy went in and overdubbed his own bass part, but Dave's 12-string acoustic guitar part remained when the song was mixed for inclusion on Electric Ladyland and later released as a single. You know we're talking about All Along the Watchtower. By May, Dave decided to come back and rejoin the band in time for their second album. This time he got to do 5 songs while the other 3 did the other 5. Mason starts out the album with a jaunty little number called You Can All Join In. It's sort of interesting psychologically. He mostly kept himself on the tracks from the last album, but this time he's inviting everyone in to help. But maybe I'm reading too much into it. I was watching Bob Newhart until they took it off Prime. Carol, could you tell Mr. Carlin to come back later? Next is the trio's Pearly Queen, a pretty heavy number that became a popular live staple down the line. Despite it being loaded with guitar, it's Steve who does all the playing. Dave only contributes the harmonica towards the end. Mason gets the next song, Don't Be Sad. It actually sounds like a Buffalo Springfield outtake or a precursor to Crosby, Stills and Nash. You know, I think there'll be next spring's guest episode, so just get ready for that next year. Who Knows What Tomorrow May Bring is next. Now, it was written by the trio, but Chris doesn't play on it. Kind of odd. It's also a little similar to another song they record soon. I'll mention it when we get to it. Side 1 ends with another Mason composition and the song that become the most famous from the record, though not their version. Feelin' Alright is an acoustic number that starts quietly and builds up. It sounds like a fun number and the perfect single. But it didn't make too much noise on the charts. Yet. I know you know when it became a hit. We'll get to it soon. Side 2 starts off with another Mason song, this time co-written with Capaldi, Vagabond Version. A very hippie-ish number, heavy on the acoustics. The next song is also heavy on the acoustics, but Dave is nowhere to be found. The official title is Roamin' Through the Gloamin' with the 40,000 Headmen. They soon shortened it to just 40,000 Headmen. It's a very folk-related number, sounding like the singer had just found Dr. Sin's stash. Scarecrow. They'd return to this type of English-tinged folk song on a later album. Next is the final Mason number, Crying to Be Heard. Interestingly, Dave does just the bass on the song, but it's a heavy, bombastic number in contrast to his other songs on the record. The last two songs on the album are written by Steve and Jim. First is No Time to Live, a plaintive number with Steve on piano and Dave pitching in on the organ. The album ends with Means to an End, sort of a counterpoint to the last song. Now, Wikipedia has Chris Wood playing the drums. I'm going to call foul on this. I'm saying it's Capaldi on drums and percussion. They do list it under the notes. And interestingly enough, this was the one song from Traffic that Steve played in his next band, which we know is Blind Faith. As the sessions were winding down in New York, it was the rest of the band's turn to pitch into Hendrix's next album. Jimi had recorded an epic demo for an undersea song he called 1983 A Merman I Should Turn to Be. From the demo heard on Electric Ladyland 50th anniversary set, he'd always intended there to be some crazy stuff going on in the middle of the song. For the actual recording, he got Chris Wood to contribute a flute part intertwining with Jimi's guitar and bass part. It certainly added to the feeling of being undersea, hanging out with all the denizens of the deep. Neptune, or Poseidon, take your pick, Triton, Ariel, Namor, Mr. Limpet. In early May, after hanging out at the Scene Club, Jimi recruited Steve and Jefferson Airplane bassist Jack Cassidy to pitch in on a new blues number he'd come up with. It was sort of based on his arrangement of Catfish Blues that he'd been performing since early on in the Experience's career, but this would be a whole new thing. The epic Voodoo Child would end side 1, done as a sort of in-the-studio jam session, recorded right on album, though the audience was added in later with overdubs. But the interplay between Jimi, Steve, Jack, and Mitch was all live. They did 3 takes, the third being the keeper, but those first 2 had some choice moments there as well. One of the great things about it was Hendrix rarely on record had a chance to play with a musical equal to push him. Winwood was just that kind of musician. Their back and forth in the middle helped build to an explosive climax. Which is why it's kind of disappointing when Steve does the song over the past 2 decades. He decides to fade the song out. Guess it's appropriate to signify Jimi's departure. The self-titled second album, Traffic, came out in October 1968, the same month as Electric Ladyland. While not reaching that album's heights, it did do better than their debut, hitting the top 10 in the UK and the top 20 in the US. But by that point, Mason had left the band. Again. Right around the same time, Cream was in the middle of their farewell tour with a final show coming up at Royal Albert Hall. By the end of the year, Winwood had gotten together with Eric Clapton and the two discussed working together. With this on the horizon, he decided to call it quits with Traffic and move on to something else. Now, we've already discussed the whole history of Blind Faith last year in the Clapton episode, so we won't rehash it here. Go back and have a listen. They're the 1969-1970 episode. I think that's part 2. What we'll try to do now and in the next episode is try to fill in the missing pieces of what was going on at that time. First up is what the other guys were doing while the supergroup was going on. Turns out Dave Mason once more got back with his old friend Jim Capaldi and Chris Wood to try another band. But they needed someone else to do keyboards. They found that person in session player Mick Weaver, who'd made some albums under the name Winder K. Frog. At first, they decided to just go by their names, Mason, Capaldi, Wood, and Frog. They decided to just use the last part since it sounded like Wood and Frog. Their biggest exposure came when they were the opening band for the Jimi Hendrix Experience's February 24th, 1969 concert at Royal Albert Hall, which, as we talked about in the past couple episodes, was filmed for a possible movie that we're still waiting for. For the concluding jam on Room Full of Mirrors, Dave and Chris came out to join Jimmy, Noel, and Mitch, along with Rocky D on congas. You'd think Jim could have come out and shaken a tambourine or something. Anyway. However, after a couple of appearances on the BBC, the band broke up. Somehow, Dave ended up crossing paths with an American rock and roll band, Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. They were just going out and having fun playing music. That appealed to him, so he joined up. Later on, a couple other guitarists had the same idea. Eric Clapton and George Harrison. We went over that last year, too. Now, as Steve was working with Clapton and Ginger Baker to put Blind Faith together, he ended up doing a few sessions here and there. One of them was for the debut album of a very physical singer from Birmingham named Joe Cocker. Producer Denny Cordell was able to corral a lot of great session players to help out their selection of unique cover songs. His two big gets were Yardbird guitarist Jimmy Page, no slouch at playing sessions himself, and Winwood. Steve, however, didn't play on the album's two biggest songs, a cover of the Beatles' With a Little Help from My Friends, which was the appropriate name of the album, and a cover of Traffic's Feelin' All Right. It was the latter that brought the song to prominence as a radio staple. It wasn't a chart topper, but did get regular airplay on the burgeoning FM radio scene. Traffic had an album left under contract, so in a similar fashion to Cream's Goodbye, the band released Last Exit. Scary title there. Only it wasn't quite as well thought out as Goodbye. Side 1 consisted of stray single-size and unused recordings. The first song, Just For You, was an early 1968 A-side from Dave Mason with an assist by Jim and Chris, no Steve. The B-side, Little Woman, had him backed by the band Family, so it must have been recorded while he was producing them. That doesn't show up on this album. The second song, Shanghai Noodle Factory, was a B-side to a single the band released in 1968. Not exactly sure when it was recorded, during the second album sessions or in later 68 after Dave left. It was the one that sounds similar to Who Knows What Tomorrow May Bring, so if it was recorded back then, it's not a surprise it didn't make the record. Next is Something's Got a Hold of My Toe, another Odd Mason track and his last appearance on the album. Kind of a throwaway, so again, not a surprise it didn't make the original album. This is followed by Withering Tree. The song was the B-side to Feelin' All Right. This is a slightly different stereo mix. The B-side was mono. The side ends with the A-side of the single, Medicated Goo. Silly sounding name, but great song. Again, not sure if this was recorded in early or late 1968. Side 2 is a real oddity. It's a couple of live tracks recorded at San Francisco's Fillmore Auditorium in March 1968, when the band was doing dates as a trio without Mason. And they're definitely not what you'd expect from them. First was basically a show tune, Feeling Good by Anthony Louie and Leslie Bracus. I'm sure some people looked at it and thought it was a renamed version of Feelin' All Right. It certainly wasn't. It runs over 10 minutes, and Wood switches between sax and flute during the song. Even the band was a little shocked. After the song's over, Steve says, "Well, surprisingly enough, we did it." Odd choice. The second was a jazzy version of Bobby Blue Bland's Blind Man. Try saying that 3 times fast. Like I said, not what you'd expect from them. Surprisingly, the album did pretty well in the US, hitting the top 20 like its predecessor. With that, Island decided to get one last bit of juice from the band by putting out a best of in late 1969. It's what you'd expect from a UK best of album, sweeping up the single sides along with choice album tracks. Side 1 consisted of Paper Sun, Heaven Is In Your Mind, No Face, No Name, No Number, Colored Rain, Smiling Phases, and Hole in My Shoe. Side 2 of Medicated Goo, 40,000 Headmen, Feeling Alright, Shanghai Noodle Factory, and Dear Mr. Fantasy. For some reason, the US version on United Artists replaced Smiling Phases with You Can All Join In. I guess they figured since it was on their version of the first album, it was covered. Best of Traffic made the top 50 on the US charts. So with Steve off on Blind Faith and Dave off with Delaney and Bonnie, looks like this was the end of the line for Traffic. Not by a long shot. Next time we'll pick up in 1970 with the band's re-emergence after the records of Blind Faith. Yet another return for Dave Mason. Two very different rhythm sections and their unique ties, and the band's second ending. Then we'll take a look at the members' early solo careers and the surprising hit single for one of them. That's next time on Keep On Grooving. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Harjar. Thanks for listening.